this, we can start to assess, well, what would it cost to protect to a certain level of elevation? What policies can we implement to make sure that landowners are adding to the near-term protective defenses that we have for certain areas? How do we plan for these areas that we're going to retreat from earlier? So we've got this measured retreat strategy where some areas we're going to give up sooner rather than others. A lot of the times the question will come up from a community member at this point, well, why are you wasting any money on these protective features? At some point you're going to get inundated and you will have spent all that money for nothing. Which I think is a really valid question. Why are we trying to protect the city? And a lot of the times they'll reference back to the vulnerability map where the impacts extended up to about Samoa Boulevard, and they were basically contained where the bay used to be anyway. And so why don't we just leave sea level rise alone and let it go to its natural extent? The challenge is obviously with that approach that we have lots of infrastructure out here that the entire city needs. The sewer treatment plant to be the most notable. But all of the drainage infrastructure the city is dependent on as well. And so this is not a problem that only affects those areas that were purple and blue on the map that I showed you of 6 feet of inundation. This is a problem, a challenge that not only faces the entire city, but the entire region, and we have to have coordinated strategies on how to address them. We're going to have contingency plans and fallback plans if we're going to accept that we're going to have a city at all. And so the measured retreat, if I could describe it in broad brush, is the low-lying areas that are mostly natural lands will likely be the first to go. We'll probably do more rehabilitation work like we did on McDaniel Slough that includes expanding the protective devices that lie behind those restoration areas that give added defense and a layer of protection to the built environment that we have. Ultimately, while we have a land-based system right now of sewer treatment that we're really proud of, we're all very proud of, that has these oxidation ponds and these treatment marshes and takes up acres and acres. Eventually, those are going to be the first to go. It's not going to be cost effective to protect those assets over time, and we'll be able to integrate the infrastructure that's in these marshes into protective features for the rest of the city, while at the same time simultaneously restoring the habitat here. So it's a slow retreat that allows us to maximize our use of the lands behind that protected infrastructure along the way. Okay, let's see. So with the shoreline gap analysis, we were really looking at, what is it going to take to protect, the city of Arcata? With 6 feet of sea level rise, that would be about a 16-foot king tide event. So we all know that king tides, the 2 highest tides of the year, they come, sometime in the winter. But around those king tides, we have a lot of other tides that are really high. The king tides we celebrate because they're the most extreme, but there's lots of really high tides during the winter around here. So just plan for 6 feet of 6 feet of sea level rise puts us at 16 feet of elevation on that tidal cycle. Again, the probability of exceeding 15 feet is the same as getting a 500-year storm event, just to put it into another context. So it's a really unlikely scenario. And currently the king tides are about 14 feet. So what would it cost to protect to that elevation? Using our gap analysis. Is there a question? Somebody's got a hot mic. Okay. So what does it cost, roughly, to protect this area, the South G Street area, the peninsula area, and the wastewater treatment plant at the leading edge? And how long a time frame do we buy, with realistic probabilities? It's kind of a question we started asking, because we wanted to make sure that if we're going to propose this as a strategy moving forward, that we had some firm basis to do that. We estimated and again, these are rough estimations, but we estimated to raise uh, the entire peninsula here, this core peninsula, so giving up some of the polishing marshes, but retaining the treatment marshes proper, and then all of the built environment, including the houses and businesses out South G Street, to raise the elevation around that area at a cost of about $15 million, which is a costly project, no doubt. We estimate the private and public infrastructure and assets in that South GS area to be $140 million. So we invest $15 million to protect $140 million, and that's in today's dollars. Obviously, over time, those dollar figures will grow. And currently, it generates about $125,000 annually in sales tax to the city of Arcata. So just from the economic perspective, this is just one lens that we've started looking at it in. Just from the economic perspective, we have to ask ourselves, does this make sense? If we have 10 years of $125,000, we have, annually, does that and the growth in property values, the taxes that we receive from those, does that start to offset maybe the 20, 30-year investment of $15 million? Obviously, we wouldn't do this all in one fell swoop, so the economics are a little bit more complicated than I'm portraying them. But if we can get to 15 feet in elevation, and that protected us until sometime between 2100 and 2200, or looking at it from a probabilistic model, if we can get to 15 feet in elevation around this entire peninsula, and have a 2% chance that that would be exceeded in the next, between now and 2100, is another way of looking at it. Is that a reasonable investment? Or should we start telling people right now the property is devalued because we're going to start taking away your land uses, your ability to maintain your properties and rehabilitate them if they're destroyed, which is probably not the best alternative for a community like ours. So ultimately, what we're proposing to the community, to the city council, to the planning commission, to the coastal commission, is that we take this area that is already this protection zone or this peninsula that is already built up to an elevation that is much higher than the surrounding terrain, much higher than, in some cases, the anticipated sea level, the 6 feet of additional sea level on top of that, and retain those uses for as long as we can feasibly retain them, using many strategies like these living shorelines and other soft protective devices, eco levees maybe on the backside, to try and build up some protection from waters flowing around from the east. And then continue to implement this strategy where we restore the habitats as we move back over the course of the next 100 years or so, and ultimately relinquish this area if we don't get sea level rise under control in that time frame. Part and parcel with this is the infill zoning that we're doing, for instance, around the K Street corridor and other areas within the city. We can't just take these areas and eliminate the uses and not plan for where that growth and development is going to happen elsewhere in the city. One of the concepts that often comes up when we're having discussions about how to adapt to sea level rise is this concept of transfer of development rights. And it sounds really appealing. If your property is in an area that potentially harmed by sea level rise, potentially vulnerable to sea level rise, you can sell your development rights to someone else in the city, or transfer those development rights to them, which makes a lot of good common sense in the abstract, but in practice has virtually no reasonable application in our community or in any community. There's, it's a good concept, but it just really hasn't been proofed out very well. There's some examples from the East Coast where this has been done, but I think with the types of uses that are allowable in our city and the land values and et cetera, I just don't think that it would play out. So creating and I've heard a lot of these sort of good ideas that are just not very practical. And so I think that as we approach uh, our policy development around sea level rise, and as we strategize how this community is going to manage, adapt, and retreat its way through sea level rise over time, that we have to do it in ways that are practical for us. So that is sort of the crux of the sea level rise strategies that we've developed to date, retaining only those areas that are most that provide the best return on investment for the protection that we would ultimately invest. Right now, we're getting ready to go through a process where we start looking at other lenses like racial and social equity issues around the folks that live in this area. So some of the lowest income housing that we have in the city of Arcata in market rate condition, and to tell those people, look, you got to go. You can't live here anymore. Your property is threatened by sea level rise, especially when they find out that even there's a 2% probability and et cetera, et cetera. It's a hard pill to swallow. We have to do a much better job of planning than that. Okay, I think I went over my allotted time frame for this presentation, so appreciate your interest, and don't think at this point we have any other participants. We do. We do have one participant. So the Planning Commission wants to deliberate and then ask questions of the community they may. Yeah, why don't you let's go ahead and try having folks just jump in, and we'll see if we can manage it that way.
Yeah. This is Judith, and I just lost the graphic here on my screen. But in that protection zone that you designated, it appears that you're thinking that this would be the new earthworks around the current sewage treatment plant that would be doing that job. But for the areas of South G and South H Street, would there be additional structures involved in protecting that? I know there's a tide gate that was, or some kind of a structure that was abandoned right about that right turn in Butcher's Slough. I'm just wondering if there are any inland structures that you're considering beyond the areas that you already outlined in that brown color by the sewage treatment.
Yeah, there are definitely modifications that will need to be made elsewhere in the city to implement the adaptation strategy. A lot of tide gate work, a lot of levee work. One of the other challenges, we didn't talk too much about this, but the inland extent of tidal influence goes pretty deep into residential zones elsewhere in the city, up into the Bloomfield subdivision, up into the downtown area, and so there will likely have to be ways to to manage and handle that water. Even if we said, hey, look, we're not going to protect anything, we're not going to put up any levees, we're not going to do anything. We've just decided that some communities have done this. They've said we're just going to start moving. When it gets flooded, we're just backing out. We're going to eliminate portions of our city. Even if we made that decision as a community, it wouldn't be limited to just the areas that are shown in the potential inundation zone. So there's lots more infrastructure that will have to be built in.
So in that protection zone, it's hard to tell if that bright yellow line cuts through current residential areas on South H Street, or if all of those are protected.
Yeah, all of the residences that are south of Samoa are included within this protection zone. This, I want to acknowledge, is going to be really tricky for those structures that are right along Butcher Slough.
Yeah.
The majority of the structures that are just south of west of H Street, they're in the floodway. The structures themselves are in the floodway already. And so it's possible that, even within this protection zone, as the strategies, the implementation measures get developed, that we, have areas, subsets of areas within the protection zone that again are going to go first. They're going to be impossible to protect. I don't know what kind of engineering would be necessary to protect those homes from even say 3 feet of sea level rise. But I think that we could reasonably protect at South H Street. And so it's possible that those properties are the first that we need to plan for relocation.
Thank you.
David, at the risk of sounding like Johnny Raincloud here, it does seem like whenever we hear best science projections, it seems like climate change is continuing to accelerate beyond those at paces that seem to confound and surprise scientists. I guess I just wonder how. I understand that 2% number is best science now, but is the city looking at the extent to which current best projections, whether it's polar ice or whatever, seem to get blown away by the pace of change?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and a lot of this has to do with sort of the the way that the data are being used. Like, what is our intended purpose here? You're absolutely right. The projections just keep getting outpaced, and every year we hear some new and frightening condition that could create several feet of sea level rise instantaneously. So I would broadly categorize them into a couple of different groups. For those that are kind of like that red line that I showed, in the beginning, right now the projections have what they call an H++ scenario. And this H++ scenario is basically the polar ice caps, they all melt at once, and we have instantaneously several feet of sea level rise. This is not on a planning horizon. That's an Armageddon horizon. We're not going to be able to set plans in motion that will help us to adapt to that. If the polar ice caps melted, the majority of the city would be underwater, inundated, and we'd be in disaster hazard mitigation as opposed to climate adaptation. So that's one bucket. The other bucket is that hey, look, these lines, they aren't stable either. These projections keep going up over time. No one has made them go down. Although I would actually say that that's not exactly true. It depends on which model you're using and how it's calibrated, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just accept these models because these are the ones that the Ocean Protection Council is using. It is true that they change over time, that those thresholds change, the probabilities are going to change over time. And in part, this is the more mundane part of the creativity that I called for at the beginning of the talk, is at the beginning of our meeting. We're going to need to be creative and continually adapt to the scenarios, but also not get locked in and rigidly fixated on a particular strategy. It could be that 2% number for 6 feet of elevation rise, if that goes to 50%, then we're in a different planning scenario. If it goes to 80%, then this whole option is off the table. When I was speaking with Coastal Commission staff the other day and we were talking about this strategy, she asked me, well, are you saying that the city is going to come out and tell everyone that they're going to protect everyone to 16 feet of elevation or 15 feet of elevation or whatever? And I said, no, that's not what we're saying. what we're saying is that these are the best projections we have right now. We're going to require that those property owners take responsibility for that information, that they understand it, and that they record on title that they understand it, so that if they convey that property, the next property owner can also understand it. If you get an entitlement to develop in this area, you have to understand that you're not operating on a 100 or 200-year time frame. And most investments aren't made on that time frame anyway. And so sort of that second bucket is that, well, we have to, we can't just not plan because the projections are changing. We have to be adaptive and recognize in our planning that we're going to be adaptive. And we have to make a plan and not wait for the changes to stop, because they're going to continue.
Right.
So
another quick point, I'm not sure how analogous or helpful this would be, but the county under John Ford's direction has been pretty successful with the RRR program in the cannabis industry by relocating cultivation rights from properties that are not up to land use code and transferring those to other areas. I'm not sure if that's helpful at all, but that's definitely been successful at the county level.
Yeah, for that you have an economics that is driving it. We don't at this point have economics that I believe would drive like the transfer development rights for for an individual property that has one unit on it and has the capacity to build one unit to then transfer that to another property somewhere else in the city. The economics just don't work out.
Right. Thank you.
David, I'd like to ask a quick question. Have you been already in dialogue with the Coastal Commission about these living shorelines, and or are there any plans, engineering's being done, drawings, how much earth it would take, how much material it would take to create these? Where are we at with these? Are we going to see them in the next 10 years?
Right now, what you've seen, I don't think it's going to be like some big dramatic change. We're not going to come out and create an Army Corps structure that everyone's going to, ooh and ah at, and that'll save the day. I think what we're looking to do is to find ways that will allow us to, modify properties over time, plan for how we will modify those properties over time, plan for the triggers and thresholds where we would start to remove that infrastructure over time as well. We aren't at the level of detail yet of actually deciding how much what the volumes of earth will be required, and where the settlement basins should be, and where the tide gates need to be. Largely in part because we need to have a certified coastal program that establishes that this is our policy beforehand. And in sort of an ironic twist, to all of this, it really is, the majority of this is really up to the Coastal Commission, because the majority of these areas where we'd be looking at adding defensive structures to help us with this policy move are in the Coastal Commission's retained jurisdiction. So we'd be going to them for a permit. We wouldn't go look at our local coastal program. We'd have to ask them for a permit to do it. But I think what we've said this whole time in our conversations with them, what we've talked about with the community, is that the the local coastal program is in part a statement of the city's preference for how it's going to handle adaptation over time. And so even if none of this policy and none of these measures that we're outlining are under a permit authority, they at least tell the Coastal Commission what our desire is on how we adapt to sea level rise here in this community.
Thank you.
In order to build those protective structures that were in that graphic, to what extent would it be necessary to actually change state and federal law? Are there assumptions that that's going to be happening?
So my response to this, used to be that the Coastal Act was, created in a flat world, and now we know it's round. And that basically this understanding about climate change and its impacts on sea level rise were not even on the radar, back in the 70s when the Coastal Act was created. And so we mapped a legislative framework that that addressed the world that we knew then. And so I do think we're going to need some legislative fixes. That is a heavy lift when you're changing something as something like the Coastal Act. But I think it's probably ultimately going to be necessary. At this point, there are other ways of managing it and handling it. And I think that that's part of the conversation and discussion that we've been having with the Coastal Commission staff. I want to reiterate that we are working through our local coastal program update, all of our responses to sea level rise, and everything else that you're reviewing in this coastal zoning ordinance, with regular meetings with the commission staff. We've been working on it for longer than I care to remember, but we've got a great working relationship now. And coastal staff, our local coastal staff, the folks from San Francisco, they've been out here multiple times. They're taking it seriously. They're listening to us, and I think that they understand, the issues that we're up against, and they fully understand all of these issues, and the points of view that we have. They may not agree with all of them, but they certainly understand them, and so. Some of it has been, just a means of, recharacterizing and making sure that, what our proposal is, comports with the Coastal Act. So, for example, the McDaniel Slough project, that type of project where you've got a levy component to it, but really it's a restoration project, is one way that coastal staff is indicated to jurisdictions that it's amenable to having these new protective structures, created on the ground. We have some limitations, obviously, with this peninsula area. For example, on the east edge, where some of the most vulnerable, access points for, backwater flooding exist. There's really no fallback there. We're not going to create some huge buffer of, restored area on the backside here without impacting these uses. And so there's still some hard thinking that we need to do on how do we get there, and connect the dots with the Coastal Act before it's ultimately potentially amended.
Are there more commission questions, or shall we close this and move on?
We do have one audience member. Her hand isn't raised, but maybe I'll just allow her into the meeting to see if she has some comments.
Great.
Okay. Jen, I've invited you into the meeting if you have some comments for the commission.
Hey there. Not really. I haven't had a chance to review all the documents yet, so I just wanted to watch your presentation and see what the new thinking is, and I'm sure there will be lots more opportunity for comment, but I appreciate the thought. Thank you.
All right.
Are you done, David?
I'm done with that, yes.
Okay. So our second business item for the evening is, local coastal program update number 3.
Yeah, and you'll be happy to know that I don't have a presentation prepared for this particular item. We will be bringing these sections of the code, on a bi-weekly basis to each of your meetings. And so, for this particular element, let me open my packet. We are looking at these sections of the zoning ordinance. Sorry, it's my packet. So today we're looking at water quality, biological, public access, scenic and visual resources. And I just want to open it up for commission, comments, get feedback and input from the community to the extent that they want to. And again, if you have comments from previous meetings, if you want to go back to some of the procedural framework, for example, more than happy to do that as well, entertain comments and open that information up as well. Again, I guess I'll just remind commissioners to take these packets and hold on to them, retain them, and start building your own copy of the coastal zoning ordinance so that you can thumb through it and make your notes in the pages. And then I guess the one thing I will say about these sections, the Coastal Commission staff received these a couple of weeks ago, and we have just now started to work through some of these chapters, and already there have been some excuse me, minor changes discussed about public access, some changes that we need to make to comport with the Coastal Act and scenic and visual resources as well. And then the water quality section is the one that you'll probably see the most dramatic changes on by the time you see it next. Their water quality unit has a number of comments. They just want to make sure that we have standards in place in this document that can be used as a threshold for coastal development permits. And right now they feel like it's a little light on those specific standards, and that we rely on stormwater prevention control plans and the state's stormwater requirements a little too heavily. So we're working with them to get additional detail into water quality section. But if you have any questions or comments on any of these sections, I'd be happy to take them down and make sure that we address them. Commissioner Mayor, yeah, we can just why don't y'all just jump on as it seems reasonable to.
I have a few questions. You can probably guess what they are. One is that a lot of the review of several of these sections depends on some maps, some figures that you've indicated by number, but which we don't have access to. Is that because they haven't been drafted yet? With the idea that you want to get the language in there first before you actually, put some boundaries on the ground, or that you just want to bring them up later on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I apologize for not having the maps prepared for you tonight. We have a set of maps that we're running through and doing quality control on, and the volume of comments that came back from Coastal Commission staff on that map set caused me to be reluctant to release them for public review at this point. But I hope to have those revised according to their comments sometime in the next couple of weeks. And so hopefully by your next meeting, I'll be able to bring the map set.
Okay, yeah, great. So another question, and sorry if I'm monopolizing questions here. I'm not intending to do that. It's just that I have this marked up bunch of paper that we might as well ask about while we can. And I noticed that in the water quality and marine resources section, we have a bunch of definitions, and also in the public access section, we have a bunch of definitions. And in a few cases, we have an indication that the definitions are for the purpose of this section. So one of those includes a definition of new construction. So I'm just wondering, are there going to be different definitions of new construction or different sections of the document? Or are we going to be considering new construction across the board as having the same definition? that's, I guess, one question.
Mhm.
And then another one has to do with this, it's more in the stormwater issues where we've got a bunch of different square footages of impervious area for different types of uses. And they all kind of hover around 15,000 square feet. I'm wondering what the rationale is for looking at 20,000 square feet for some and then leaving it up to the director, presumably you, for others, and what some of your discussions were about varying those numbers rather than just saying, hey, we have a dividing line here at 15,000 square feet of impervious area.
Mhm. Yeah, great questions. In terms of new construction being used, that phrase is used actually throughout the document in some areas where the intent is to distinguish for the purposes of that particular resource type. And I would have to double check if you could cite the page where that's used.
I guess I'm looking at packet page 28 under public access, 2.26.020, number A, because it's A2. There's a map there. It says, for the purposes of this section, new development doesn't include the following type of project. But elsewhere, there's, for the purpose of other sections, are we going to be having a whole slew of different definitions of new development? And what are the implications of having to redefine that new development, which would then trigger a different kind of permitting review?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think the answer for this, and thank you for pointing to the specific use of it. The answer for this is that that's basically the same as saying these types of projects are exempt from these regulations. And so that's the purpose of it. The new development means the same thing throughout the document. It's just that I guess the way to look at it is that, some of these regulations, some of the requirements for public access wouldn't be triggered for new development that doesn't cross a certain threshold. And so it could be maybe worded differently, but that's the effect of it. And then in terms of the water quality section, I think we based a lot of those criteria on state stormwater requirements. And there was, an attempt by, our consultant to try and bring in some language that had been used in other recently approved local coastal programs. And we did I met with Kristen just last week, Coastal Commission staff, Kristen just last week. And she identified that section is going to need some fairly substantial editing. Their water quality staff work real closely with the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And so I believe that the standards they asked us to implement will be real close to the state standards, if not, verbatim the current state standards. And this is one area where, I would characterize our conversations around the local coastal program into three different categories. One is, we maybe, came and wrote something a certain way, and they've got suggestions for how to modify it. And, it doesn't substantially affect the will of Arcata, the will of the people, the will of the decision makers. And so we're, just saying, yeah, we'll change those things. There's another body, and this one would fall into that group where, we feel pretty strongly that the local coastal program should really just reference the state MS4 requirements. And so we have a difference of opinion on this particular point. I think ultimately we're going to give in to their desire to have more specific standards in here. The challenge is this, is that when the state decides to change the standards, we're going to have a specific set list of standards in our code. And we're going to have to say, oh, in addition to that one, you have to do this other one that's not in our code. And it just makes it a little more challenging to communicate with the public about. So I would rather have our local coastal program track with state law as it's being amended and just reference the MS4 requirements. If ultimately at the end of the day we lose that conversation, it's not going to be the end of the world. And so that's, that's another bucket, that we're working from. And I expect that language to come back revised.
Okay, and I have one more question. There are about, I think there are 5 different references in here for for feasibility. It points to the idea that if something is whenever possible, whenever feasible, and I'm wondering who then determines feasibility in each of those cases, because obviously, a developer is going to want to determine feasibility differently than people who may be trying to protect public views or biological resources. So I'm just wondering, is that one of the things that you're working on in terms of who determines feasibility?
That will largely be to the decision maker. So whoever the review authority is will ultimately make that decision as to whether or not, they've proved feasibility. A lot of the language, that is that, how should I say this? So that I think most people consider the Coastal Act to be this, really rigid, sort of overbearing regulatory tool. There's in fact, at the Coastal Commission level anyway, there's a lot of policy balancing that they have that they can do. There's a lot of flexibility within certain areas of the review process. The challenge is that in exchange for that flexibility, they require studies for pretty much everything. And so when you're given that flexibility, you have to prove it on an individual basis. The only other way to deal with that is to make a more rigid sort of black and white rule. But then that doesn't take into consideration the site specific challenges. And I guess my thinking is that the Coastal Commission gives itself that flexibility, that leniency. Why shouldn't we give it to ourselves? Our last LCP was basically just a carbon copy of our standard zoning practices, and we actually have rigid standards, but then we build in some escape valves, if you will. But you can't use those escape valves in the local coastal program because they're not substantiated with the reports that the Coastal Act requires. And so we're working with the Coastal Commission right now to make sure that wherever we've given that flexibility, we've adequately addressed the requirement for those site-specific studies, and that we have a good process for review and also appeal. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, somebody says, "Hey, it's just not feasible for me to develop this property if you make me apply that standard." Then we ask them to go do a report to prove it, and then they bring it to folks like you all and say, "Here's my report." And then whether it passes muster with you is what determines whether it's feasible. But we can look at those in more site or specific detail throughout the code if you're interested.
Any other questions on this or comments? David, on the agenda, it says that we are to receive a report and provide a recommendation on the local coastal program.
Jeff, you have any? And part of the reason we put that in there is that the Attorney General came out with some guidance recently that says that if you add an agenda item that says discuss, topic A, then the commission is actually prevented from making any kind of formal action. And so you'll see that from here on out. If it's just a discussion item, I'm going to ask for a recommendation in case you decide you want to make a recommendation, you can do it.
Okay. Thanks for the clarity. Looks like there's no further discussion on that item or a recommendation. So we'll move on. Thank you, David.
Yeah, it looks like there's no public comment. We're on correspondence and communications.
Okay, so no public comment, did you say?
Yeah, there's no public comment.
Okay, thank you. Yes, correspondence and communications. Does the city have any?
I'm all talked out.
Okay, anything from the commission? All right, we can adjourn. Thank you all.
Thank you.